This is lesson 1915, the Napoleonic Era, 1799 to 1815. How did Napoleon Bonaparte assume control of France and much of Europe, and what factors led to his downfall? College Board Topic 5.6, Napoleon's Rise, Dominance, and Defeat. Explain the effects of Napoleon's rule on European social, economic, and political life. As consul and first emperor, Napoleon undertook a number of enduring domestic reforms while often curtailing some rights and manipulating popular impulses behind a facade of representative institutions. Napoleon's new military tactics allowed him to exert direct or indirect control over much of the European continent, spreading the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. We also have this from College Board Topic 5.6, explain the nationalist responses to Napoleon's rule in Europe. Napoleon's expanding empire created nationalist responses throughout Europe. Places: France, Egypt, Saint-Domingue, time frame 1775 to about 1815. Key concepts of the Napoleonic era. We have the Grand Empire, the Continental System, the Napoleonic Code, coup d'etat, and nationalism. Napoleon, perhaps you might call him the last enlightened absolutist. He was from the Mediterranean island of Corsica. He was born in 1769. Corsica was French territory, but not culturally part of France. Napoleon actually grew up speaking Italian. He spoke French with an accent his entire life. And so he was an outsider when he arrived in France to go to school. He was from a minor noble family in Corsica that was not rich. Napoleon came from a large family. His mother gave birth 12 times. 8 children survived to adulthood. And as a political leader, Napoleon would employ all 7 of his siblings in one capacity or another. He grew up to be probably about 5 foot 3 inches tall. Average height of a French man at this time was 5'5". Toussaint Louverture was only 5'4". Napoleon was especially close to his older brother Giuseppe, or as we often call him, Joseph. In 1778, Napoleon's father took him and Giuseppe to school in France. This was what noble families in Corsica did if they could. Napoleon was only 9 years old. He didn't see Corsica again for almost 8 years. Napoleon spent 6 years at a tough military academy. He was known to be willful and feisty, but he loved math, history, and geography. He then studied at an elite military academy in Paris, and he was the first Corsican to graduate from there. He was given a position as an officer in the artillery in 1785. Napoleon was an avid reader. He loved works by Enlightenment leaders. He studied closely what Enlightenment thinkers had to say about military matters and politics. And when the French Revolution came, Napoleon was 20 years old. He participated in French revolutionary efforts and activities back in his home on Corsica. Conflicts over his political views eventually forced him to leave Corsica, but his experiences in tough Corsican politics conditioned him to be a tough-minded political player. The French Revolution represented an opportunity for Napoleon. He became a Jacobin and a follower of Robespierre from lesson 1914. He was put in charge of the artillery in the Reign of Terror effort to take the city of Toulon back from the British. The French military leaders built their plans to take Toulon back around Napoleon's ideas and use of artillery. And we talked about Toulon back in lesson 1913. During the fight, he was injured by a bayonet. His horse was shot out from under him. But Napoleon had masterminded the defeat of the British at Toulon, and he was only 24 years old at the time. And important people took notice of him. When Robespierre fell, Napoleon actually went to jail for 2 weeks. He was highly involved in all the high society salons of the Thermidorian period from lesson 1914, and he famously put down a royalist uprising on behalf of the Directory. He married his wife Josephine in 1796. Militarily, things had actually been looking up for France since about 1794. They had defeated Spain and gotten Spain to ally with them. They had made peace with Prussia, who wanted to concentrate on partitioning Poland. They had kicked the Austrians out of Belgium, that is, the Austrian Netherlands. and France was creating a sister republic out of the Dutch Republic. If you'll remember, this had been very much a Girondin idea to spread the values of the revolution throughout Europe. In 1795, the Dutch Republic became the first of many sister republics, changing its name to the Batavian Republic. Napoleon's Italian campaign, 1797 to 1799. The French Revolution inspired many Italians to do the same thing in Italy that had been done in France. Italy was ripe for revolution when Napoleon invaded. In 1796, the Directory decided that they already had enough to consolidate inside France's natural borders, and that creating sister republics among Italian revolutionaries would be taking on too much. France was still at war with Great Britain, Austria, and various Italian territories, including Piedmont. But Napoleon had different ideas. The Directory decided to invade Austrian possessions in northern Italy merely as a way to distract the Austrians and force them to divert resources there. They sent Napoleon to lead this sideshow in Italy. Napoleon had never yet led an entire army. He was only 26. But the main assault against Austria in Germany got bogged down, while at the same time Napoleon was having great success in the supposedly less important Italian campaign. He defeated the Kingdom of Piedmont in 2 weeks and knocked them out of the war. In May 1796, he marched into the city of Milan. Napoleon chased the Austrians to within 100 miles of their capital of Vienna. Remember that Austria held a lot of this northern Italian territory, so when Napoleon was invading Italy, he was primarily fighting against the Austrians. This feat of getting that close to Vienna was astonishing to all of Europe. Napoleon formed 2 sister republics in Italy without the Directory's permission. And when Napoleon got so close to Vienna, the Austrians sued for peace. So much for the campaign that was supposed to be merely a distraction from the main action in Germany. In Italy, Napoleon developed some of his most famous military strategies that he would use for the rest of his career. First, he formed close relationships with his men. He would get down in the trenches and work alongside the ordinary enlisted men. And this was where he acquired the nickname the Little Corporal. He gave out engraved swords to his soldiers for acts of bravery. He made sure his troops were well supplied even when the French government couldn't supply them. Instead of relying on supply trains, he demanded that conquered territories offer up food and wine and shoes and boots and blankets, etc. And he encouraged his soldiers to forage for supplies locally. Napoleon also became known for speed and mobility. Foraging and requisitioning supplies from the land meant that you could move quickly because you weren't waiting for your supplies to catch up to you. But it also meant that you had to move quickly because the countryside could only supply so much before your troops depleted the area. This plan worked well in northern Italy where there was a lot of food and supplies available. He used advanced fighting formations that French tacticians had been working on, which younger recruits could master more quickly than those previous fighting formations. And he used quick skirmishers to get behind an enemy and disrupt their own supply lines, which forced the enemy to fall back. Another tactic was using the terrain to one's own advantage. For example, Napoleon avoided crossing rivers. Getting all your men and horses and guns and ammo and supplies across a wide river was a logistical nightmare. You were also very vulnerable to attack while you were doing it. So instead, Napoleon used his speed to gain control of the best bridges in the area. He also used bridges and speed to outflank his enemies. All of these strategies were put into great effect at Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Lodi. Napoleon was also brilliant at self-promotion. You can think of this also as a military tactic. Napoleon publicized his victories back in France, describing them as much more brilliant and significant than they really were. He founded several newspapers back in France to report on his wins, and these publications would exaggerate his victories and the strength of his enemies with military bulletins, and these kept Napoleon in the public eye. And they crafted Napoleon's image as a hero. Napoleon and Destiny. It's easy to write Napoleon off as a megalomaniac full of selfish ambition and lust for power. However, Napoleon saw his place in the world differently. Napoleon was obsessed with what he considered to be his, quote, destiny. Even our textbook makes note of it on page 635. There's a big difference between selfish ambition and, quote, destiny. Destiny feels like it comes from another place. You can't stop destiny like you can stop ambition. The person at the center of it has no more ability to control it than anyone else. Of course, this is all contingent upon believing in destiny, which Napoleon did. Napoleon and politics. Napoleon, with the help of Italian patriots, formed two more sister republics. The Sispedane Republic, its flag was modeled on the French tricolored flag, only with green instead of blue and with horizontal lines instead of vertical lines, and the Cisalpine Republic, and this one was eventually absorbed into the Sispedane Republic. He also formed the Ligurian Republic around Genoa. This looks like three sister republics, but it's really two because the Sispedane Republic was absorbed into the Cisalpine Republic. Napoleon signed the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria in 1797. And Austria felt humiliated by this treaty and vowed to someday get revenge. They had to release their claim on Lombardy in northern Italy, and they had to recognize Napoleon's two sister republics, Cisalpine and Liguria. But Napoleon also did something to totally disappoint the Italians as well. He gave the Republic of Venice to Austria, and Venice had been an independent republic for centuries. Napoleon oversaw the formation of three more sister republics in Italy: the Roman Republic, 1798 to 1799, the Republic of Lucca, and the Neapolitan Republic. However, Italian revolutionaries who were supporting these republics met with a lot of resistance from their own people. Many of them resented the heavy-handedness with which the French conducted the creation of these Italian republics. These were short-lived republics, but they got Italians thinking about the possibility of someday forming a unified Italian nation. These governments experimented with other French government ideas that we've seen, such as confiscating church property, French Republican calendar, rights for Jews, secular education, etc. When we look at Napoleon's Italian campaign, we see some concepts that will become important later. We see that France's foreign policies were much more about politics than about spreading their revolutionary ideals. They were conquering territories abroad, and they were plundering the wealth of these territories. Napoleon even brought art experts with him to remove famous art pieces and take them back to France. The French were also taking, giving, and trading conquered territories, such as Lombardy and Venice. They were directing the formation of client states rather than letting the Italians themselves form their own governments. And most importantly, we see the rise of nationalism in response actually to two things. First, inspiration by French national success, and two, resentment of French heavy-handedness. We also see how the Directory is losing power and control over their foreign policies. They're becoming more dependent upon their generals, like Napoleon, to conduct foreign policy and negotiate important peace treaties for them. This situation is going to present people like Napoleon with opportunities to gain leverage over the Directory and eventually take over the French government. Napoleon in Egypt, 1798 to 1801. Let's do some myth busting. Here's the myth that teachers often teach in school about Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to be a hero and a conqueror, so he invaded Egypt because it was an easy target. In Egypt, Napoleon's men shot the nose off the great Sphinx at Giza because they were using it for artillery practice. This act was typical of the European disdain for other cultures and their antiquity. Napoleon was defeated in Egypt, and then he rushed back to France, leaving his men stranded in order to present himself as the hero. Except that very little of that is true. Napoleon already had many victories in Europe, especially against Austria. And Napoleon invaded Egypt actually because of Britain. Great Britain was the only enemy still fighting against France at this time, and Britain's navy was too powerful for the French to take on directly. Britain's ability to fight France depended on its profits from trade with its Indian colony. Napoleon hoped to occupy Egypt in order to disrupt lines of trade and communication between Britain and India, and this would force Britain out of its war against France. France also had legitimate colonial aspirations in Egypt, especially since they had lost control of Saint-Domingue. Also, Napoleon's men did not shoot the nose off the Great Sphinx. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt was a scientific as well as military endeavor. Napoleon had 167 scientists with him. They discovered the Rosetta Stone. Examinations of the Great Sphinx showed the marks of hammers and chisels rather than military shells. Descriptions of the Great Sphinx missing its nose go as far back as the 10th century. Muslim scholars from the 15th century attribute the destruction to Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar in the year 1378, who thought that the local Muslims in the area were making sacrificial offerings to the Sphinx, which would be idolatry. By taking its nose off, al-Dar intended to show the Sphinx's powerlessness. Napoleon did not actually abandon his army in Egypt and leave his men trapped there. That's an oversimplification. In truth, Napoleon's fleet was destroyed by the British in the Battle of the Nile. This did leave Napoleon with serious logistical problems. Napoleon did take an expeditionary force into Syria from Egypt, which suffered defeat. He was trying to cut off the Ottomans. Napoleon went back to France after having won a great victory at the Battle of Aboukir. Napoleon returned to France when he heard that the political and military situation there had become unstable. Also, the Egyptian campaign seemed to have stagnated. However, Napoleon left his army in charge of the highly capable general Jean-Baptiste Kléber, and Kléber continued to win victories for France in Egypt. Jean-Baptiste Kléber was assassinated by an Islamic student. Kléber's command was succeeded by Jacques-François Menou, who was very unpopular with his men. Napoleon actually called him a fool. Menou married Zobeida el-Bawab, daughter of a rich Egyptian, and he converted to Islam, and he changed his name to Abdallah. Menou had to surrender to the British after the siege of Alexandria. However, Menou was able to work out a deal with the British to finally transport all of those French troops back home to France. But he also had to surrender the Rosetta Stone to the British, which they still have. Napoleon seized power in France by ousting the Directory. The Directory and its many problems. We've talked about how the Directory was weak and corrupt and people were sick of it. But what specific examples of this can we point to? So now you have 5 concrete reasons that you can clearly articulate for why the Directory, after 4 years in power, was bad and had to go. First, a 5-man executive office is a bad idea in a political environment where there are such deep divisions. Political factions will be competing with each other over policy all the way up at the very top. Nothing will get done. The Directory was also caught up in a much larger nationwide atmosphere of political differences that were tearing all of France apart. Thermidorians and Royalists and Neo-Jacobins were all still around, all still competing for power. Next, the Directory restricted political power to men with property. The idea behind this was to make the Directory more moderate and stable by cutting out radical factions such as the sans-culottes. But the popular, that is to say lower, classes had gotten used to having a political voice as well, and they resented being disenfranchised. And this narrowed the Directory's base of political support and caused it to be unstable. Third, the Directory was still extremely hostile toward the Catholic Church. In 1798, when France invaded Rome, the Directory even had Pope Pius VI kidnapped, and he died in captivity a month later. The overwhelming majority of French people were still Catholic, practicing privately, but some also defiantly practiced publicly. There was a severe shortage of priests in France. People in the Vendée and Normandy and Brittany where religious feelings were particularly strong, were still fighting the Republic of France over this. And the French people were demanding a reconciliation with the Catholic Church. Fourth, the Directory was still at war with numerous other powers. In particular, what was called the Second Coalition, an alliance among Great Britain, Russia, and Austria. And this war footing meant a permanent draft, what we called the conscription en masse, from many young men. And the war was not going well in 1799. The Russians and Austrians had pushed the French out of Italy. The British and Russians had seriously considered invading France together through Holland. However, the Directory got a very lucky break at the last minute by defeating the Russians in Switzerland. And this caused Russia to leave its alliance with Great Britain and Austria before this invasion could take place. Fifth and last, the Directory was neck-deep in electoral corruption. In 1797, when an election gave a bunch of legislative seats to royalist deputies, the Directory panicked and sent troops in to arrest these new deputies and deport them, thus overturning a free and fair election. There were still large royalist pockets in France fighting the Directory. Then again in 1798, the Directory used legal manipulation to overturn the free and fair election of a bunch of neo-Jacobin deputies. And all of this totally undermined the Directory's claim to be legitimate and representative. The ousting. Remember Abbé Sieyes, the priest who wrote What is the Third Estate back in 1789? Guess where he was 10 years later in 1799? He was one of the 5 members of the Directory. Although he was one of the 5, he wanted to end the Directory and replace it with a more stable, more authoritarian system. The more scary and unstable things look, politically and socially, the more appealing a strong authoritarian figure starts to become. And you know it's bad if Abbé Sieyes had lost faith in the Third Estate. That's the state that our society and our politics are in today. We have to resist the temptation to give up on our democratic values. General Napoleon Bonaparte was not Abbé Sieyes' first choice to be that new authoritarian. But Napoleon had just returned from Egypt, a perceived hero, and he was the man that Abbé Sieyes was stuck with if he wanted to get this done. Together, Abbé Sieyes and Napoleon planned the coup of 18 Brumaire, that is, November 9th, 1799. They and their supporters in the legislature spread a conspiracy theory of a neo-Jacobin plot to take over the government and bring back the Reign of Terror. They pushed through an emergency measure to move the legislature to a location outside of Paris. They got the legislature to make Napoleon, quote, Commissioner of Paris. 3 of the 5 members of the Directory resigned on the spot, and this was going to make the coup much easier. The next day, in the new location, everyone knew there was some kind of plot afoot to get rid of the Directory entirely. Napoleon showed up with troops to the legislature. But the neo-Jacobins challenged Napoleon, took a new oath to the Constitution, and basically debated Napoleon out of the building and back outside to his men. It looked like the coup had failed, and the neo-Jacobins had won the day. But then, Napoleon's brother Lucien, a leading deputy in the legislature, got in front of Napoleon's men and made a passionate speech in which he told the troops 3 things. Number 1, Napoleon was not a threat to freedom. And number 2, he held up a sword, pointed it at Napoleon, and said, I vow to plunge this into my own brother's chest if he ever threatens the liberty of the French. And 3, he said the neo-Jacobin deputies were about to bring back the Reign of Terror, and Napoleon was the only one who could stop it. And Napoleon then led his troops back into the building with bayonets, and the neo-Jacobin deputies fled the scene. With the neo-Jacobin deputies out of the way, the remaining members of the legislature voted the Directory out of existence. Napoleon and Abbé Sieyes knocked out the Constitution of the Year 8 in a few weeks, creating a new republic called the Consulate. Its total aim was to centralize power in France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen were absent from this new constitution. It called for 3 what were called consuls. A first consul, that would be Napoleon, and 2 advisory consuls. Abbé Sieyes chose not to be one of the consuls. He and Napoleon didn't really like each other at all. This new constitution called for a legislative body that was appointed, not elected. They could not enact legislation, only the consuls could do that. Local officials were appointed from the top based upon locally produced lists of candidates. Napoleon put the Constitution of Year 8 up for a vote by almost all adult men in February of 1800. But the ballots were not secret. Voters had to sign their names and their votes into a register. So if you wanted to vote no, but you didn't want that no recorded in a registry next to your name, your only other option was to sit out the election entirely. And because of that, only about 20% of eligible voters turned out for the vote. The vote was 3 million yes to 1,500 no. Napoleon's brother Lucien had doubled the number of yes votes with fake ballots, though obviously he didn't have to. They had the votes. Many in France predicted that Napoleon would not be able to hold on to power. But Napoleon served as first consul from 1799 to 1804. Napoleon moved into the Tuileries Palace the very month that he became first consul. Even though King Louis XVI had lived in that same palace, Napoleon did not act like a king. He presented himself as a man of the people, and he wore ordinary clothes and the same clothes every day. Observations about the coup of 18 Brumaire. It's for important lessons like these that we study history in the first place. First, it had an overlay of legality to it. Even though there were bayonets, there was also a vote by official representatives of the government to give Napoleon and his allies what they wanted. And that brings us to the well-documented effort to overturn the 2020 election. Our Congress voted to certify the election in spite of this coup attempt. But what might our congressional leaders have voted to do if they had been intimidated enough, or coerced enough, or convinced enough, or if one party had been purged? They could have voted to do or change almost anything, even the Constitution itself. Second, it was based upon the false premise of a, quote, national emergency. The pretense of a national emergency can be used to trick followers into thinking that they are protecting something rather than destroying something. Napoleon's soldiers went home that night singing revolutionary patriotic songs, convinced that they had just saved the Republic, not brought it down. But there was no real neo-Jacobin plot to bring back the Reign of Terror. Napoleon and his allies had simply made this up to get the neo-Jacobin deputies out of their way. And we will see authoritarians use this tactic again in our course. The lesson is, if a leader is not getting his way and he declares a, quote, national emergency, watch out. He or maybe she is planning something big and sinister. Third, earlier coups and electoral corruptions had made Napoleon's Brumaire coup seem less significant than it actually was. The corrupt Directory had recently overturned 2 previous elections. So Napoleon's coup seemed to the people of France to be less of a big deal. Napoleon and his allies took advantage of how tired the French people were of the previous 10 years of political division and instability. The next day, the stock market in France jumped 10%. Our old friend from lesson 1906, Bishop turned Foreign Minister Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, who was in on the plot, actually bragged to Napoleon that he had, quote, made a killing in the stock market based upon his inside knowledge of the plot. Again, January 6, 2021, was probably not the last coup attempt that we will see in this country. A comparatively more gradual and more subtle coup attempt could go almost unnoticed by the American people if we do not stay politically vigilant. It's tempting to say, I'm just so sick of all the conflict and all the controversy, I just don't even pay attention anymore. But that's a feeling that benefits authoritarians. Election procedures also played a key role in Napoleon's legitimacy. Yes, there was a massive fraud on the part of Napoleon's brother, Lucien. However, that fraud was unnecessary. Napoleon still won overwhelmingly. But what really won the election was the laws and procedures. Requiring people to record their names and votes into a registry caused a lot of Napoleon's non-supporters to abstain from voting. Manipulation of voting laws and voting districts are very powerful ways to get the results you want. So far, at the time of this lesson, 19 U.S. states have enacted about 34 laws to make it harder for Americans to vote, all in the name of, quote, election integrity, where there were no election integrity issues to correct. One of the things that gave Napoleon great power at home was his ability to win on the battlefield abroad. One of the first things Napoleon did as first consul was to knock Austria out of the war entirely. And he did it by crossing the Alps into Italy and confronting the Austrians from behind. This event is where we get Jacques-Louis David's famous painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps on a white steed. Napoleon actually crossed the Alps on a mule. Mules are more sure-footed. That's why you don't ride a horse down into the Grand Canyon. Jacques-Louis David also put the names of Hannibal and Charlemagne on the rocks along with Napoleon's, just to show how daring and historically significant Napoleon was. Napoleon came very close to losing to the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo in 1800, but he managed to pull out a big win, and he came to France a bigger hero than ever. Then one of Napoleon's generals defeated the Austrians again at the Battle of Hohenlinden. Military successes can give you even more power if you can convert those military victories into diplomatic successes, and Napoleon was a highly capable diplomat. The battles of Marengo and Hohenlinden put Napoleon in a great position to negotiate a treaty with Austria that would extend his power both at home in France and abroad. In 1801, Napoleon signed the Treaty of Luneville with Austria. In the treaty, Austria had to acknowledge French control of northern Italy, the west bank of the Rhine River, and Belgium. Austria had to recognize the satellite republics that France had created in the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Italy. Napoleon also made treaties with Bavaria, Naples, Spain, Portugal, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. But the biggest diplomatic triumph of all was the Treaty of Amiens, which was made with Great Britain in 1802. In 1802, Great Britain was all that was left of the Second Coalition. Russia and Austria were now both out of the war. Great Britain had no choice but to agree to the same territorial terms that Austria had agreed to. Europe was at peace for the first time in 10 years. However, peace with Great Britain would only last 14 months. Napoleon and the Revolution. People are always confused about Napoleon's policies in relation to the French Revolution. Was he a friend of the Revolution or an enemy of the Revolution? After the coup, Napoleon said, "I am the Revolution. The Revolution is over." And what he seems to have meant was, the revolution has completed itself in me. I am its logical end. Therefore, there is no further need for any more revolutionary ideas or revolutionary activities. Now is the time for government to get to work and get actual things done. Napoleon's top domestic priority was not to continue the revolution, but to depoliticize France. That's a term historians use. Napoleon didn't actually use that term. This meant bringing order and calm to France, and it meant turning down the temperature on all of the political rhetoric and agitation that had gone on. Napoleon eliminated all political clubs in France. He got rid of 2/3 of the most radical members of the government of Paris. He reduced the press and free speech. Napoleon reduced the number of newspapers in Paris from 73 to just 13, and then later just to 4. Each department in France, remember France was divided up into 83 what were called departments, could only have one newspaper. In Napoleon's mind, the issue was not the suppression of free speech, but rather the suppression of political agitation. His attitude was, Paris doesn't need 73 newspapers stirring up trouble when 4 is perfectly adequate for informing the people. He also negotiated peace with the Catholic Church. This peace was called the Concordat of 1801. Napoleon was not a religious man, but he could pretend if necessary. Look at the quote to the side. Napoleon's main objective was to heal France's cultural divisions. The Concordat took 8 long months of intense negotiations with Pope Pius VII. But in the end, both sides got something that they wanted. The most important terms of the Concordat of 1801 reflected Napoleon's desire to control the Catholic Church in France and make factions within France happy. For example, protecting wealth and private property was a key component of Napoleon's domestic policy. He viewed this as crucial to his success. So, the Concordat of 1801 didn't return lands that had been taken from the church by the French Revolution and auctioned off to private citizens. Those people got to keep all of that property. Napoleon also still selected bishops and ran church finances. Catholic clergy would still be paid their salaries by the state. Eventually, even Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis were paid by the state. In exchange, priests were no longer required to take the highly controversial loyalty oath to the state that we talked about, and Catholics could practice their faith openly. The Christmas Eve plot of 1800 shows a lot about Napoleon's priorities and his hold on power. When he had been first consul for almost a year, Napoleon narrowly escaped an explosion from a bomb that was meant to kill him on his way to the theater. Napoleon's chief of police found the conspirators through a brilliant piece of police work. He uncovered 2 royalists who had done it. But Napoleon insisted that it was the work of anarchists, in other words, Jacobins. Napoleon distrusted the Jacobins the most. They were the most critical of him. They had the most liberal ideas. Jacobins and royalists, as we know, are on opposite ends of the political spectrum and would never cooperate on a plot to kill Napoleon. In the end, they executed 2 royalists who really were guilty and 9 Jacobins who had absolutely nothing to do with the plot. Napoleon also took the opportunity to deport another 130 Jacobins without even accusing them of anything. He simply wanted to get rid of them so that they could not stir up trouble with their ideas. Even Napoleon's most liberal advisors went along with this obvious miscarriage of justice. In supporting Napoleon's version of events, they opted for stability and order instead of truth. They chose this over the uncertainty and messiness of defending the rights of these Jacobins. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Before this happened, the Senate had a vote on it. Napoleon's supporters in the Senate had several arguments in favor of it. First, there was no danger to the revolution in doing so because Napoleon was a child of the revolution. Second, making Napoleon's position A, more powerful, and B, hereditary, would discourage any of his enemies from attempting to assassinate him. After the Senate voted for it, they put it to a plebiscite to all men in France. The votes in favor won out. The Senate made the imperial crown hereditary, and Napoleon had now founded a dynasty. But Napoleon had no children of his own. During the ceremony at Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon famously took the new crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed the crown upon his own head. Napoleon had actually negotiated this with the Pope ahead of time, so Pope Pius VII was not surprised or anything. In naming a successor, Napoleon bypassed all of his siblings, and this angered them greatly. He had put them all in positions of power, and they did a lot for him. Instead, Napoleon convinced his stepdaughter to marry his brother Louis. If the two of them had a male child, that child would be the heir. Even though Napoleon's imperial dynasty was founded by a popular vote, many people were disillusioned by this megalomaniacal move by a supposed man of the people and child of the revolution. Napoleon's broad appeal. Napoleon offered something for everybody. For ordinary people, Napoleon represented glory, peace, a return to religion, stability, and a chance to move up in society. For example, Napoleon represented the opportunity for an ordinary person to move up in the ranks in military or civil service, just the way that Napoleon himself had. For Republicans, Napoleon represented protection from royalists and old regime privilege. For rich people, he represented a defender of property and a toning down of radical thoughts and activity. He let a lot of the émigrés return to France and even gave them positions of authority and responsibility. There were major parts of the French Revolution that Napoleon totally suppressed. Democracy, free political discourse, many egalitarian social reforms. But he also preserved parts of the French Revolution. He made peace with the revolution's foreign enemies, and he secured France's, quote, natural frontiers. The Napoleonic Code of 1804 was the accomplishment that Napoleon was most proud of. He did not actually write it, but he met constantly with its writers. In a modified form, the Napoleonic Code still governs French civil law today. Napoleon would take his code to much of Europe. It made France's abolition of feudalism and privilege permanent. It gave all males formal equality before the law. It secured the wealth and property of private people. It was a national code. It was meant to be rational and systematic. It replaced all of the diverse local laws and customs that had been around during the old regime. The Napoleonic Code failed to support women's rights. Napoleon was notoriously conservative regarding women's rights. He consistently pushed the writers of the Napoleonic Code to strengthen the position of fathers and weaken the independence of women. For example, a father could overrule his child's marriage choices up to the age of 26 for sons. Napoleon saw the family as a tiny nation within a nation. The husband and father should be the absolute ruler, just as Napoleon himself was the absolute ruler of France. Many French people agreed with Napoleon that preserving patriarchal authority within households was key to holding French society together. The code retained the right to divorce, but it made it much harder for women to get than for men to get. A husband could get a divorce after just one instance of infidelity. A wife could get a divorce only if the husband brought his mistress into the house to live with them. But the code also preserved some equal rights and limits to the father's power. For example, fathers were required to pass their inheritance equally among all of their legitimate children. The code kept some French Revolution values: the secular state, free from interference from any religion, equality before the law, no more privilege. The code got for Napoleon the support of the elite and the middle classes of France. Expansion into Europe. Napoleon's dream was to conquer Great Britain. The Treaty of Amiens only lasted 14 months. Both the British and the French were guilty of violating it. Historians have different opinions about specifically why they went back to war after 14 months. But after much arguing and taunting between the two, Britain finally declared war on France in May of 1803. Napoleon made plans to invade Britain. He spent 2 years building up troops, supplies, and ships along the Atlantic coast of France for an invasion. This effort formed the core of Napoleon's finest army, the Grande Armée. But Britain had an excellent navy that controlled the English Channel, far superior to France's navy. Our textbook says that Napoleon gave up on invading Britain after the disastrous naval Battle of Trafalgar, but he actually gave up before that. Napoleon tried to lure the British Navy away from the Channel. He famously said, "Let us be masters of the Channel for 6 hours, and we are masters of the world." And he used the French and Spanish navies to try to make the British think that he was going to attack their colonies in the Caribbean. However, the British were not tricked, and they did not move their ships away from the English Channel. And this was when Napoleon gave up all hope of ever invading Britain. But he still had his massive Grande Armée, and he planned on using it. Napoleon turned his attention eastward toward the rest of Europe. In Central Europe, Napoleon had been provoking Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain ever since he had made peace treaties with them. He had crowned himself Emperor of France. In Germany, he occupied Hanover, the ancestral home of the British kings. He reorganized the boundaries of a bunch of small German states to his own liking. He crowned himself ruler of Italy and renamed the Italian Republic the Kingdom of Italy, and he annexed Genoa from Austria. So Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden formed the Third Coalition and declared war on France in September 1805. We've talked about how Napoleon rejected major parts of the French Revolution and was conservative in numerous ways. But for these conservative European monarchs, Napoleon represented the scariest part of the French Revolution. He was a non-royal upstart, threatening royalty and taking crowns that he had no right to. Again, these powers were forced to make peace with Napoleon on his terms, because Napoleon got his Grande Armée from the Atlantic coast and across France so fast that it caught them by a complete surprise. Remember, he's fast. And he was able to defeat Austria and Russia individually before they could combine their forces against him. In 1806, Napoleon consolidated his power in the Western German states between France and Austria by creating a vassal state called the Confederation of the Rhine. It created a buffer zone between France and Austria and Prussia, and it completely ended the last vestiges of the Holy Roman Empire. Prussia had tried to stay neutral, but finally, King Frederick William III decided to attack Napoleon. Napoleon again used speed and more advanced tactics to overwhelm the Prussians. Napoleon could have stripped Frederick William III of his crown, but decided instead to settle for an indemnity payment and the loss of a third of Prussia's territory. Napoleon's Grand Empire. This consisted of 3 parts. Number 1, the core, and that was an expanded France. Number 2, dependent satellites, states that Napoleon created and ruled. For example, Spain, the Kingdom of Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Holland. You simply put your family members in charge of these countries and they'll be loyal to you, in theory. And the third part of the Grand Empire was independent allies. These were allies that also knew to toe the line. Napoleon and nationalism. Napoleon sparked strong feelings of nationalism wherever he conquered. People outside of France could admire the way that Napoleon centralized power by creating a sense of loyalty in the French, giving the French a common destiny, a common law code, common enemies, a common history, a common government, and common identity. But they also resented the heavy-handedness with which the French government administered the territories they conquered. You can kind of think of it like a bully unconsciously teaching his victim his best fighting moves, and the victim learning how to defeat the bully by learning his techniques. The most concrete example of nationalism was Spain. Spain had been an ally of France. But in 1808, Napoleon took advantage of quarreling within the Spanish royal family to take over the country completely. Napoleon removed Spain's king and put his brother Giuseppe on the throne instead. Spain responded with an open revolt. It lasted many years, and Giuseppe never got complete control of the country. Spanish nationalists conducted continuous guerrilla warfare. Spain also got lots of conventional help from Britain and Portugal. The Peninsula War, as it was called, ate away at Napoleon's resources. The Grand Empire and the Continental System. The Continental System was basically a huge blockade designed to destroy Great Britain economically. Every part of the Grand Empire was expected to refuse British shipping. But Russia wouldn't cooperate. Also, Britain had some blockading power of its own, and Britain actually did more harm to France than France did to Britain. And the Continental System ultimately failed in its objective. The invasion of Russia, June 1812. Napoleon blamed Tsar Alexander I for the failure of the Continental System and invaded Russia to punish it. He formed an army of 600,000 men. One-third of it was French. The Russian winter and starvation got Napoleon's army. 370,000 died, 200,000 were taken prisoner, and Napoleon made it back to France with a mere fraction of his grand army. Napoleon's, quote, allies and, quote, satellites took this opportunity to abandon him. Napoleon's first exile, April 1814. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed the Quadruple Alliance. This was too powerful for France to defeat. Napoleon abdicated from the French throne, and the alliance exiled him on some very favorable terms. He got to keep his title. He got to rule the island of Elba, not just live there, but rule there. And he got an allowance of 2 million francs per year. But 8 months later, Napoleon snuck back into France and took it over again. The Battle of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. Prussia and Britain scrambled to stop Napoleon, and they met Napoleon at a village called Waterloo in Belgium. The battle was a gruesome full-day total bloodbath. The French had 25,000 dead and wounded, and the Allies had 23,000 dead and wounded. The British and Prussians barely won. But Napoleon this time abdicated for good. This time Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, where he wouldn't be able to reach anybody.